Hi AP Seminar students, Mr. Muller here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about finding credible sources for crafting your arguments. In our last video we talked about level 1 research, so developing a what, why, and order statement, problem statement, and research question to gather preliminary sources to create an idea map and craft a working claim or thesis. Today I'm going to be talking about how you gather those sources in order to take a what, why, and order statement into a research question and working claim. Hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. Now, there are three different types of sources that exist when you're trying to find information and doing research. Primary resources are the ones you really want to look for. This is original data. Those are the original experiments. Those are the original letters. These are the quotes from people. If you're looking at history, this is the actual source material. If you're looking at English, these are interviews and original data from surveys. If you are doing something in sociology, again, you want to try and get original data. Secondary sources are pretty good. It's interpretation of that existing data. So instead of doing the experiment, they're talking about the implications of it. Instead of getting the sources directly from an expert in a quote, they're talking about what it means. Again, you want primary sources, but secondary sources can be good for supplemental use. Tertiary sources are textbooks. You would never ever want to use them in research because they're very basic and shallow. However, if you want to know general information about your topic in order to find better sources, you can always go to tertiary textbooks. Wikipedia would also be considered a tertiary source. If you want to know more about a topic, you could always go to the Wikipedia page for it and then actually look at the sources that are listed to try to get some of those primary or secondary sources. So let's say that I'm going to be writing an argumentative essay on should capital punishment be outlawed? Should it be made illegal worldwide? So the idea of you can be killed by a justice system for committing a crime, should that be outlawed? So let's say my what, why, and order to statement is I want to determine if the benefits or the advantages and disadvantages of capital punishment, because I want to determine if it should be outlawed in order for my readers to understand the ethical implications of capital punishment and the consequences of keeping it or eliminating it, right? Okay. So now I need to find sources that will develop a problem statement so I could really know more about that, so I can develop a problem statement, see the gaps, and develop a research question. So I need to find some general sources about capital punishment. Well, there are different sources I can look for. What I really want to try and find are scholarly journals. These are sources you find in particular databases like EBSCOhost and JSTOR. You can also use Google Scholar. These are sources that are written by people with PhDs, research fellowships. And because they are written and published, most likely they're also peer-reviewed, they're very, very credible. However, the problem with scholarly journals are there's a lot of lag time. It takes a long time for things to be done, published, accepted. So if I'm looking for really modern stuff, I could also use newspapers. Now again, you gotta be careful about what newspaper you use. New York Times, LA Times are pretty good, but there are some issues with credibility because they're written by journalists. So if you were ever going to include them in an argument, you'd have to establish, all right, are these still credible? But if I'm just trying to find out information about capital punishment, yeah, sure, I could look at some newspapers. Government websites are good for statistics and science and medicine because it's got a lot of data. Those are websites that end with .gov. I could also look for social media just to see controversies. I would never want to cite that in an argument. So how do I go about finding information about capital punishment? If I know what I'm looking for, journals, maybe some newspapers, again, maybe some government websites if I want some data. What I need to do is do an effective keyword search. So I could just throw in my topic into Google, like capital punishment, or maybe I go into EBSCOhost and put in capital punishment. I can do that, or I could also do synonyms for capital punishment. So I could say the death sentence, or I could say death row, or I could say lethal injection, or gas chamber, or electrocution, or hanging. And I could throw those synonyms in for capital punishment and see if I get different sources that way. I could also use terms that refer to related people or ideas. So instead of capital punishment, I could say forced executions. Or maybe I could think about the particular maybe company or a particular prison in a state that has capital punishment and know more about that. And the reason why I'm using different keywords is so I can get as many different types of sources as I possibly can about this issue. Now, when I'm doing preliminary research, and especially when you're doing level 2 research, when you're really trying to get some credible sources because you're actually going to write the paper, you really want to use databases, especially in an AP level, because the information from databases are really going to be most credible. Most of the time they're peer-reviewed, they're done by people with PhDs, they're typically very well detailed. Those are the ones you want to use. The different databases I would select are EBSCOhost and JSTOR. Now, I'm actually going to be giving you, when we come into start the year, I'm going to give you my password for my graduate school so that you can access the EBSCOhost documents and JSTOR documents from my actual college library. It's going to give you a much wider range of things to look for rather than just EBSCOhost that you would just get access to for being an AP student. Google Scholar is also decent, but again, my suggestion when we come into class is I'll give you my actual grad information, and then you could access the databases that I have access to as a grad student. So let's say you open up that database. So let's say I'm writing a graduate paper on education, and I'm going to go and open up a certain database called ERIC, and I put in my keywords, and it pops up with all these responses. So I choose an article. I'm not just going to choose it, print it, read the whole thing. That's going to take hours and it's pointless. What I want to find are articles that are directly related to my topic. So I'm going to read the abstract. The abstract is just a paragraph or two at the beginning of a paper that tells you what the research was about. If I look at it and see that it's directly connected to my topic, I'm going to save it. If it isn't connected, I'm just going to throw it out. Once I think the abstract, if I think the abstract is good, I'll print it, make sure it's in full text, because sometimes the sources they give you don't allow full text. If you run into that issue, like let's say is, oh man, this is a great source, it'd be perfect for my paper, but I can't get the full text. Email the author. Put the author's name into Google. They typically work for a university. Email them and say, I loved your paper, I really want a copy of it to use for an argumentative essay, can you send it to me? And typically they'll say yeah, and they'll actually send you the PDF version. Sometimes they may even send you more sources. I had a couple of students in Capstone who did that and got not only what they were looking for from the author, but other sources as well. So great idea to do that. So again, when I'm looking at these databases, read the abstract. Once I think the abstract is good, I take it. Typically read the introduction and conclusion just to make sure that it's still aligned. If you want to also use it as a springboard for finding more sources, go to the bibliography section. Because typically what that author will do is cite existing research that they use to build their own research. So you can go in, look at that bibliography, and actually try to search for those sources. That'll help you find more about that topic. So let's say I'm looking at capital punishment, and I go onto the database, I say capital punishment or death row, and I get some sources, and I read the abstracts, and I've got maybe 3 or 4. And so I read them, and I think they're good, and it's giving me a good idea about capital punishment, and I'm learning more perspectives, and I see the problem, so I can do a problem statement and a research question, and maybe I'm going to save the bibliographies for a little bit later when I need further research, because I'll check the bibliographies, see if there's anything they cite that I think that'll give me more important information. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Muller, what if I just use Google? What if I just go on the Twitter? What if I use social media? Come on, man. You're such an old man. Don't you understand this is the 21st century? Okay. The problem with using just random websites is there's no quality control. It's not peer-reviewed. There's no real support that says that's credible. If you need to use regular websites, make sure they say .gov. Those are probably the most credible, but again, those are mostly used for statistics. The only reason you should ever use social media for research is if you're trying to understand the conversation of a topic more. Like maybe I would check social media or blogs or YouTube to look more about some controversies in capital punishment, but I would only use them to get a general understanding to then go more in depth and find better sources. So, just some keywords for evaluating web sources. EDU is generally credible if it's from a research center, but again, you want to try and do professional journals. .gov are most credible because they're from government resources, but .orgs, .mls, .nets, you really don't want to do that because typically they're not going to be super credible because they're going to have a lot of bias issues. So, just one note on government sources really quick. I've got a couple listed down there that you can check that will give you some good data if you are a little stuck. And again, these are best for data charts, things like that. Another thing you can do is read a book. You know, books by particular researchers, those are always really good. Again, scholarly journals, which I mentioned before, are fantastic because they are written by experts. They contain a list of references to find more sources. What you want to stay away from are popular journals like Forbes and Newsweek and Time. Those aren't scholarly journals. Popular journals aren't used for information. They are written by journalists. They don't have a lot of references. So again, there's a difference between scholarly journals and popular journals. Now, when you're looking for those scholarly journals, if you're looking for preliminary research in level 1 or more in-depth research in level 2, something that's going to be really helpful is the idea of it being peer-reviewed. And typically when you do these database searches, you can check a box that says peer-reviewed. Again, you want to do some preliminary Raven checks. Again, does the author of the work, is he pretty reputable? Is the source current? You want to make sure the source you're using is typically about 15 years or less old. If it's over 15 years, you may have some issues with its credibility. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use it, but you definitely have to address those limitations. And one other thing you could check, especially Google Scholar, it shows you how many other papers have cited those papers, so that actually helps with credibility as well. One last thing with engaging sources is you have to think about what kind of evidence your readers are going to want. It depends on your essay what kind of sources you're going to use. So if I'm using capital punishment and I'm trying to convince people that capital punishment should be outlawed, well, what would convince my readers, what kind of evidence would convince my readers that it should be outlawed? Well, maybe doing including some stories of people who were killed who ended up being innocent, or maybe noting the numbers of people that are executed from capital punishment. I have to think about for my readers, what kind of evidence is going to best convince them? Is it going to be data? Is it going to be quotes? Is it going to be things from experts? Is it going to be things from government sources? You're going to have to be the judge on that, and it's based on the topic that you're looking for. Well, that's all there is for today. Hope you learned something you didn't know before. Thanks for watching.